I'm Jojo Nem Singh. I'm currently a global fellow at the Wilson Center, and I'm the program coordinator of a 5-year research program entitled Green Industrial Policy in the Age of Rare Metals, or GRIP-ARM. I am the author of this new book called Business of the State: Why State Ownership Matters for Resource Governance, and it's published by Oxford University Press. The central point of the book is to examine development strategies of mineral producing states in Latin America, but you can imagine more broadly, this applies to commodity producing countries across the global south. In particular, I was puzzled by the question around why particular state enterprises persist despite efforts towards privatization and liberalization of the market in the 1980s, 1990s, even up until the early 2000s. So the book offers a historical and political economy analysis of state ownership, and in particular, the evolving relationship between national governments and their state-owned companies. So on the one hand, it's about why states have decided against the privatization of SOEs in strategic sectors. But on the other hand, it's also about how state companies themselves have designed new strategies in response to economic globalization. So the book began very long time ago, as early as 2008, as a PhD dissertation. And this was a context when Latin America was experiencing a very long commodity boom. That's between 2002 until 2012. Many scholars during that time have been writing about the changes in the region. They were particularly interested in the Andean countries, looking at Bolivia, looking at Ecuador, Venezuela, and generally the left turn in Latin America, in the southern cone specifically. They were basically trying to map out radical political changes in the regional landscape. So that's the pretty much the context of the work. I was interested, on the other hand, on how countries have successfully managed their natural resource sectors in ways that deflected pressures of globalization, in ways that presented more continuity than changes. So that is how I ended up looking at Brazil and Chile. Looking at these two cases, they are particularly interesting because they posit very long, very strong sense of institutional stability. These are countries known for political stability and institutional continuity. But in particular, these are two countries that have very well-established state enterprises. So I was quite curious how and why these enterprises, these public enterprises, survived the privatization. So that was really the start of the project. So the book evolved from, just being about two countries that are interesting comparisons of state enterprises towards a book that looks at how commodities, how natural resources, strategic resources have played a persistent role in economic development in these countries, and how those changes have been managed by national governments and by the state companies themselves. The current debate, in this current period, mineral states are being called upon to become suppliers of raw materials for worldwide decarbonization. A lot of the global proposals on climate change, however, have often forgotten the need to pay attention to the domestic politics of mineral producing countries. So the book revisits why and how state ownership matters in navigating the difficult political choices to extract minerals, to promote the oil and gas industry, to phase out fossil fuels. So in general, we have a perception that resource nationalism is a risk in the global decarbonization, in worldwide decarbonization, in achieving supply chain resilience. And so the book offers a long-term view about resource sovereignty, its history, but also the difficult challenges of maintaining state companies in order for resource-producing countries to benefit more from their natural resources. So in a way, the book offers a different view about resource sovereignty. It corrects some of our general assumptions about state ownership. And also, it offers a different understanding on how SOEs are managed. And it emphasizes the fact that there is a spectrum on how state ownership can be designed and implemented. And so, state ownership in Chile is very, very different from the state ownership you will find in China, in Brazil, in South Korea. One of the most important selling point of this book is that it compares two countries that have often not been compared. So Brazil and Chile are not countries you easily compare because they're, in terms of size, Chile is a commodity producing country. Brazil is a very complex, it's the largest democracy in Latin America outside of the US. And we often assume that these are quite different political economies. So what I wanted to do in the book is to show that there are generally comparable patterns of institutional development and strategies, particularly in the resource sector. So Brazil and Chile are very much committed to attracting foreign investment, welcoming private sector participation in strategic industries. But they also are important cases in which state companies have been, not only have survived privatization, but they thrived for several decades already. So this goes against the typical portrayal of Latin American policymaking as a very cyclical process. So there's a lot more continuity in policymaking and politics in Latin America, particularly if you look at the countries under examination in the book. In terms of what is interesting examples of, on resource governance, this is the first book, as far as I know, in the in the Anglo-Saxon, the Anglophone world, that examines very closely the involvement of Petrobras in the corruption scandal Lava Jato. I talked a lot about the functional nature of corruption, why it was, why did it happen at that particular moment. And then I compare that to the experience of East Asian countries as well, what we call developmental corruption or structural corruption in Korea, in Taiwan, in Japan. So the book offers some interesting comparisons, not just within Latin America, but also outside of the region. I think decision makers in mineral consuming countries need to have a better and more nuanced understanding of resource nationalism. We can't have a blanket approach when we think of nationalization of natural resources. In particular, I'm talking about, so in the cases that we've looked at in Brazil and Chile, state enterprises played an important role in developing technology, in promoting sectoral development, in restructuring the economies. And of course, other countries have a very different approach to resource nationalism. And so, particularly if you compare that to Bolivia, to Venezuela, where there are more radical reforms, but also more inconsistent policies being implemented in the resource sector. So I think a very nuanced understanding is important, because if we want to think about supply chain resilience, if we want to think about how critical minerals will be secured for global decarbonization, we need to have a good understanding of how different reforms in the resource sector of different mineral producing countries are designed and implemented, so then we can have an appropriate response to the changes in the sector. In terms of the lessons for mineral producing countries, so equally, policymakers have to think about policy options and the choices that exist. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to resource nationalism. In some instances, state enterprises work. In other instances, they remain to be vessels of rent-seeking and corruption. So we need to be very careful in terms of how public enterprises are managed, but also we need to understand that these public enterprises perform many different roles depending on the political context. The main takeaway, I think, is that public enterprises are not going to go away. So we must have a better understanding of A, their role in economic development, and then B, the ways in which public enterprises function in the political system. And that's really the core of the book. Public enterprises play very different role in society, in economy, in politics, but they're also conditioned by their historical context. And so because we are unlikely to see state enterprises disappearing, we may as well have a better understanding of how these companies function and how they relate to governments, to businesses, to foreign companies, but also to citizens and to their workforce. So I think that's the most important takeaway for the book.